Okay. With Abish's help, today's daf is Masechta Baba Basra, daf Pei Hey, 85. And we're starting from Pei Dalid Omid Beis, uh, by the end of the Omid, Rav Shmiel, you see, and Mamish, the last line of the Omid, Pei Dalid Omid Beis. I just want to point out, it's kedai to remember if somebody can just do the research, the Gemara in the previous page, in a certain side point, had a question: what color the sun is? Sun, is it white or is it red? So the Gemara concludes that the actual color of the sun is red. It's just white during the daytimes because you can't see that it's red, but really it's red. Science says not so. Science says that really it is white. The color of the sun is white. During sunset, sunrise, it looks red because the light goes through the atmosphere, and red doesn't scatter. All the blues and everything scatters. White light has all the colors, and it scatters, but so you can't see it. Only red, which is a long wavelength, you can see during sunrise and sunset. But the Gemara's conclusion is that the Gemara had this question, and the Gemara's conclusion is that the actual color of the sun is red. Interesting. Anyway, now we're talking about what we're talking about like this. Uh, know that you can be kinda something, you could acquire something if someone throws it into your backyard. Into your backyard, your yard is your chotzer, and you could acquire something, right? That it's yours. So if someone throws an item into your backyard and wants you to acquire it, you could acquire it. Now, what happens? What is a keli of a person? You own, let's say, a basket, your personal briefcase, right? So if someone throws something into your basket or briefcase, that can you acquire that? So that would be like your little chotzer. Okay, let's imagine you have a portable chotzer. So Rav and Shmuel, up to the bottom of the page, Rav and Shmuel, the Amri Tavaya, Rav and Shmuel both say, Kalev Shel Adam, let's say the basket of every person, wherever you are, if someone throws an item into that basket that belongs to you, and let's say it's on the floor, of a place, so then you could acquire it any place. Chutz Rishus Rabim. But if you have your basket laying in the Rishus Rabim and someone puts something into that basket, you're not coin it. Why? Because you have no permission to put your basket down on the floor. A Rishus Harabim is a thoroughfare that no one has a permission to put anything in the Rishus Rabim. The same idea is why then Varegel is potter in Rishus Rabim. If you leave tomatoes in Rishus Rabim and an animal eats it, the owner of the animal is not chayiv to pay because you have no permission to leave your fruits in the Rishus Rabim. Rishus Rabim is just meant to go. You can't put anything down. So therefore, the kalev of a person, if laying in the Rishus Rabim, would not be koina. That's the opinion of Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Shimon Lakish Amri Tavei, Rabbi Yochanan and Shimon Lakish both say, Afilu Rishus Rabim. Even in Rishus Rabim, the basket of a person owning to a person would be koina. So on the surface, you would think that Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish are arguing Rav and Shmuel. So straight up, right? Amar Papa said loy pligi. Nobody argues. Everybody would agree in a Rishus Rabim, it won't work. Your kalim will not be koina. You can't be with your basket in Rishus Rabim. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish said it would work. They're talking about a simta. Kam Rishus Rabim. In Rishus Rabim, it's not going to work. Kam simta. In a simta, it would work. Simta is like like the safety zone on a highway, or we'll call it a service road, so to speak, off a main road, off a Rishus Rabim, where everybody is allowed to park their items there. You're allowed. It's like a side road to take a rest stop, where everybody has a right to put their items down. So in a simta, everybody has a right to put their baskets there. So therefore, in that case, that's when Rabbi Yochanan or Shlakish both say that if you put your basket in the simta, you could make an acquisition. Says the Gemara, "V'amai korelei rishus rabim." Why did Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish call it a rishus rabim when it's actually called a simta? It's called a side road of rishus rabim. And says the Gemara, they wanted to stress she'ein rishus yachid, that they wanted to stress that it's not a rishus yachid. A rishus yachid, a regular rishus yachid, has walls around it. So certainly, kelev of a person would be kind in rishus yachid, but even in a simta which has no walls around it, so it's more similar to a rishus rabim in that case. But since you have a right, the public has a right. It's like a park or something. You have a right to put your basket there on the floor. So therefore, it would be kaina. And this would logically make much sense that Rabbi Yochanan Shlakish hold that only in a simta kelev of a person would be kaina, not in a rishus rabim. The Amar Rabba Bo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabba said, name Rabbi Yochanan, kelev shel adam kaided loy b'chol mokum sheyesh loy. The vessels of a person can be used to acquire anything wherever a person has a right to put it down. And any place that you can put it down. So here they say only if you have a right to put it down. Yesh loy rishus, only if you have permission to put it down on the floor, then your kelev would work. Your basket would work as a place where you can acquire things. Ain loy rishus, but if you have no permission to put it down, loy, then not be quiet. Then you're not going to. You're not. If you have no permission to put your basket there, then loy, the acquisitions would not work. Shema Mina is a good proof. So, Steve, we're just in the middle of Pei Hey Amid Aleph. So, just to tell you what we're discussing over here is what happens. You own a basket. Now, to acquire something, you've got to put it into your hand. But let's say you have a basket, and and the item that you're trying to acquire, let's say it's a fruit, right? So you're trying to acquire it. So if your basket is placed in an area where you're allowed to put your basket down, and let's say you're in somebody's property, so you can put your basket down, so you can put it on the floor. Then you can acquire fruit or the item that you want to purchase, right? But that only works in a rishus where you have permission to put it down. But in a rishus harabim, if your basket is in a rishus harabim, placed on the ground on a major thoroughfare, a major rishus harabim, since in a rishus harabim nobody has a right to put items down, nobody has a right to put their basket on the floor of a rishus harabim, so therefore you can't acquire it. You can't acquire it. Now, how does all this work? All this works because when you're making acquisition in your basket, that's called a kinyan chotzer. It's almost like somebody puts it into your property. Just like if someone throws an item into your property and wants you to acquire it, and he throws the item into your property, right? So then you acquire it because you could acquire something because something called kinyan chotzer. Your backyard acquires it. Here, a basket, if you own a basket, that's like a portable chutzir. So wherever you have a right to put it down, and you walk away from the basket, and somebody puts something into the basket with the intention of selling it to you, right? So then automatically you acquire it once it reaches your basket. I'm trying to point out that even if you didn't pay the guy the money, you still acquire the item. The money that you owe him for purchasing the item becomes like a loan that you're going to eventually pay. But if he puts something in your basket, and your intention is to acquire it, right? And his intention is to sell it. So now you own the item. So if anything happens to the item in your basket, then it's really it's yours, and therefore it's your loss. You still owe the money. But that's only if you put the basket in an area of rishus rabim, in an area, where you have a right to put your basket down on the floor. But if you put your basket in the rishus rabim, you have no right to put your basket in rishus harabim. So therefore, even if the item entered your basket, you're not kaineh. You don't own it because you had no right to put your basket in the rishus harabim. So that's the Gemara saying. So the Gemara is going to prove not so, that even in a rishus harabim, your basket is kaineh. Toshma, come in here. Abba midas b'moicherim. There are four characteristics of a sale. Okay. Four characteristics of a sale. The Gemara is going to give you, the Bryce is going to give you four cases. Now, let's say the basket belongs to a third party. Okay, the basket belongs to a third party, and this third party lent the basket to the seller. Let's say the seller is selling fruits, and as soon as the seller finishes counting the fruits that he's selling you, let's say it's 10 pieces, as soon as he puts it into that basket, the basket now belongs to now the basket is now lent to the purchaser to acquire that fruit. So it says like this. The basket belongs to a third party, and the seller is counting fruits and putting into the basket. He borrowed the basket to use as an item to hold the fruits. So until he did not finish counting out how much fruits he's putting in the basket, the item didn't transfer ownership from the seller to the buyer. So if anything happens to that fruit, it's really the buyer's loss, the seller's loss, because the seller did not transfer ownership to the buyer. Mishnus Malakada Mida, once the basket is completely full, that means the seller finished counting the fruits that he's selling. Now, who owns the basket? Who's now borrowing the basket to make the acquisition? The purchaser. So if anything happens to anything in the basket, la lekeach, it's already belongs to the purchaser. So when did we say this idea? Let's say the basket belongs to not the seller, not the buyer. It belongs to a third party. So then those halachas apply. Now pay attention. That's case number one. Case number two is where you pay attention. Let's say the basket belonged to one of them. Let us say the basket belonged to who? The purchaser. So Rishon Kana, as soon as anything enters that basket, the purchaser owns the item. As soon as you put one fruit into the basket, another fruit into the basket, it works. So far so good. But when do you say that the basket could do the acquisition? B'reshus harabim. It could even happen in Reshus harabim. And even with a courtyard that doesn't belong to any one of them. For example, let's say it's the buyer and the seller, and the courtyard belongs to a third party. So if the purchaser put his basket on the floor of the Reshus harabim or the courtyard that's not his or not the seller's, so then as soon as the fruit entered the basket, you're kaina. So here we see clearly in the brisa that the basket of somebody, if he places it down in the Reshus harabim, could make acquisitions. The purchaser can make acquisitions with his baskets that's on the floor of the Reshus harabim. Now you would think not so, because who gave you a right to put your basket on the floor? That is the question of the Gemara. But first, the Gemara allows the brisa to finish off. Aval b'reshus moiche. Let's say the basket of the purchaser is in the domain of the seller. Loi kona, then you're not acquiring it, because since the basket is placed in the domain of the seller, let's say in the front yard of the seller. So loi kona, the purchaser did not acquire anything until he lifts it up, or until he takes it off the property belonging to the seller. Because once it's in the property of the seller, so then even if you put the basket on the floor, you're not koined. It doesn't work, because the seller probably didn't give you permission to put the basket on the floor, and maybe the whole area belongs to the seller. So therefore, you're not acquiring it until you take the basket and bring it to you, lift it up, or remove it by schlepping it away off, dragging the basket without lifting it off the property of the seller. Case number 4, b'reshus lekeach. Let's say the basket is in the purchaser's basket, is in the seller, in the purchaser's property. Kivin shekibel olav moicher kana lekeach. As soon as the seller said, "Oh, I'm selling it to you," right? Kana lekeach. Then the purchaser owns it. Okay, the purchaser owns the item. Bershus. Okay, so now that's case number 4. Continues case number 4. Bershus haloi amufkodem etzloi. Let's say the seller doesn't have the fruit, and the buyer is not where the fruit is, but the fruits are deposited by a third party, and the seller wants to sell it to the purchaser. So how does the purchaser acquire fruits that are in somebody else's, the third party's property? So loy kana, the purchaser does not acquire the fruits achi kabel olav oy achi yiskars mekaimim until the third party says that I am giving the property that's underneath the fruit to the purchaser, to give him the right to acquire my property so he can use it to purchase the fruits. Or the purchaser pays the shomer, pays the third party who's holding on to the fruits for rental space so he could acquire the property underneath the fruits. And by acquiring the property underneath the fruits, so he has a little chutzir. He owns that area where the fruits are, so the purchaser can acquire the fruits from the seller. But the point that we brought this whole brisa is the question was you have a basket belonging to the purchaser and he places it down in the Rishus Rabim. Does he make an acquisition? We said not. But we learned in a partial quote of this brisa, Rishus Rabim of Chotcha Sheina Shosneim, and Rishus Rabim, and a courtyard doesn't belong to anyone. The basket of the purchaser can be used. So we go to Amid Beis. My lab Rishus Rabim. So you see clearly that in Rishus Harabim, the purchaser's basket is effective in making an acquisition. Answers the Gemara Loy. The brisa doesn't mean a real Rishus Harabim. It means besimta, the side road where you have a right to put down the basket, and there the acquisition will work. But in a Rishus Harabim, actual Rishus Harabim, where you have no right to put your basket down, the acquisition will not work. Says the Gemara, how could you say it's talking about a simta? It says Rishus Harabim and a chotzer not belonging to both of them. And a chotzer, let's say a chotzer belonging to the third party, we have no position, you have no right to even enter that courtyard because it's somebody else's property. So that's what the Rishus Harabim is like, where you have no right to put your basket down. So it must be, since it juxtaposes the Rishus Harabim to Chotzer Shein Shosneim, it's talking about an era where you have no right to put the basket down. Nevertheless, the brisa is telling you that the kinyan does work. Answers the Gemara, no. My Chotzer Shein Shosneim Nami. What does it mean that Chotzer doesn't belong to any one of them? The loy the high kula, the loy the high kula. It doesn't belong to this one, and it doesn't belong to this one. It's like a simta. It's like they both have a partnership. It's like the service road or the safety part of a side of a main thoroughfare where both the buyer and seller have a right to use it. So only in an area where you have permission, where there's no law that you can't put your basket down, only in that area will your basket be an effective acquisition. Now the Gemara asks a question. Rav Sheshes asked the question from Rav Huna. Let's say you have the ownership, the basket belonging to the purchase, like we're talking on this whole time. But it is it's now in the domain of the seller. So does that work? Does that work to effectuate a kinyan or not? Because the fact that it's in the rishus of the moicher, because it's in the domain of the seller, could be that the domain of the purchaser is nullified because it's in an area totally belonging to the seller. So it cannot have the purchaser's chotzer within the chotzer belonging to the seller. So it's not going to work. Now, before the Gemara brings the brisa that we just spoke about as a proof, the Gemara says, I could give you a proof from a Mishnah. And that's why the Gemara chooses to bring a Mishnah. Amalei, so he said, Tennessee. Rav Huna said to Rav Sheshes, it's an open Mishnah that it should work. What's the Mishnah talking about? The Mishnah is talking about a get. A get has to be thrown into the woman. The woman has to have it in her hand. If she doesn't have it in her hand, if it comes into her chotzer, into her domain, she could acquire the get and she becomes mugureshes. What happens? A man threw his wife a get and it landed on her skirt, right? That's not touching her body. The part of the skirt that's not touching her body, right? Or it's in her basket. Now, where's this basket? Probably her basket is in her husband's house, right? And she's not touching the basket. He dropped the get into her basket. Harezin mugureshes. So we see that she becomes geget. So what do we see from there? That it's the caleb of the purchaser, which is the woman, in the domain of the seller, which is the husband, and it says it works. The get is effectuate. So there's a proof that caleb of lekeach in the domain of the seller does work. That was the proof. Rav Huna answered Rav Sheshes. Amalei Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman said not so fast. Maish tama b'shat mahi. Why did you try to solve it from that brisa, from that mishnah? The mochele mei uklib ukle. We already bashed that mishnah. That mishnah is no proof with 100 whips with a metal weight on it. First of all, the Amar Rav Yehuda Mishmuel, who shows a kalta tluba. The basket is not on the floor. Rav Yehuda Mishmuel said that case is talking about the basket is on her body. So if it's on her body, she's kind of then maybe chotzer would work. Then it would work, or maybe it's like hagbah. But it's not. That's not in the. It's not lying on the floor of her husband's house. That's what Shmuel said. It's connected to her. But even though, and it's being pulled onto her on the ground. So that could work. But it's not just lying there on the ground. It's actually tied to her arm. It's talking about the basket was between her legs. She's lying on the floor. And she's sitting there squatting on the floor, and the basket is in between her legs. So just like he doesn't mind where his wife is sitting, he's not going to mind the space that the basket takes up. So therefore, the place is like she owns that place. The husband was actually selling. She's a basket salesman, so he doesn't mind an extra basket in his domain. That's why it works. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mokem Cheka Konela, Mokem Kalta Konela. Rabbi Yochanan said that he gave her the place. He actually that Mishnah is talking about. He made a separate kinyan to give her ownership of the place where her lap is, where the skirt is, or where the basket is. Amar Rava, my time Rabbi Yochanan. Why do Rabbi Yochanan say such a thing? That he automatic, even if they didn't actually make a kinyan, but it automatically belongs to her. That person, even on his ex-wife or his almost ex-wife, he's not makbid. He doesn't care so much if her on the place that her lap is or the place where the basket is. He doesn't mind that she owns that spot for the time being, so she could be kind of her get. What we're talking about over here is a guy is measuring out the fruits into a basket belonging to the purchaser, and it's on his floor of the seller's domain. Do we say maybe the seller, it's a strange purchaser. Maybe he didn't give him a right to own the karka, the space where the basket is. So it could be that the kelev of lekeach in the domain of the moicher would not work. So answers the Gemara. Let's bring it from this brisa that we discussed just now. El pshoit milaha. We learned it from our brisa. We just quoted a brisa, case number 3. Bershus moicher. The brisa is clearly that if you put your kalim, the purchaser, presumably, brisa is talking about the purchaser's kalim in reshus moicher, right? The brisa says it doesn't work. It doesn't work unless the purchaser lifts up his basket and lifts it up, so he's kainit, or just pulls his basket off the property of the seller. So we think my law the brisa is talking about the basket belonging to the purchaser, and we see it doesn't work. Clearly, it doesn't work. So that's case number 3 of the brisa on Amud Aleph. Answers Gemara, Loi. That's the reason why it doesn't work. It's not that the purchaser's basket over there. The Caleb de Moicher, that's talking about the seller's basket. The seller's basket. So if it's in the seller's basket, in the seller's reshus, so then the purchaser has to make another kinyan because he doesn't own the basket, he doesn't own the domain. So he has to make a lift it or pull it off the property of the seller. Says the Gemara, if that's the case, with the ratio of the Caleb de Moicha, say Caleb de Moicha. If you're saying case number 3 is the purchase is the seller's domain, so this end of the brisa is also about the seller's domain. Amos Sefer, let us take a look at the end of the brisa. Bershuz loikeach. If we're talking about let's assume that the brisa is talking about the seller's basket is in the purchaser's property, as soon as the seller tries to accepts the price agreement, then the purchaser acquired the item. If we're talking about the seller's basket and it's on the purchaser's property, why is the purchaser acquiring it? Why did the purchaser acquire it? It's in the basket belonging to the seller. So it's a basket belonging to the seller, and you're telling me that that basket does not become nullified to the property of the purchaser. And says the Gemara, Seifa Asim L'Keach of the Keach. Actually, the fourth case is talking about the basket belonging to the purchaser. So the third case of the Bryce is talking about the basket belonging to the seller. And the fourth case of the Bryce is talking about the black basket belonging to the purchaser. Concludes the Gemara, my Pascha. How do you know that? Because Stama de Milsa. Let's talk about, if you have to think about it, wherever the transaction took place, that's where the item, the basket belongs to. If it took place on the seller's property, then probably the basket on the property belongs to the seller. If the action took place on the purchaser's property, then it probably belonged to the purchaser. So that's why that Bryce is no proof of anything, and therefore we're still going to try to resolve this question. The basket of a purchaser that's lying on the floor of the seller's property, does it work or does it not work? And we're going to continue discussing this Be'ez Hashem tomorrow.